Today I'm going to be talking about AEM CF Extras and what that is and how it can be used. My contact info for LinkedIn and Twitter there if you want to follow up with me afterwards. And I will have another slide with the project link at the end. There's a lot of content to cover, so I'm going to probably rush through this a little bit, but I'll get through it. And let's start out with what is AEM CF Extras. So this is something I've been working on for a little while now that came up as a requirement. Of course, always starts as a requirement. And using content fragments to extending content fragments to fulfill requirements that we have with clients. So let's start with, okay, what was the problem? So we want to store things in our AEM. Typically, we store web pages and assets and that sort of thing, but we just want to store data in our AEM. And a couple ways you could do this, you of course would be with an external database. You know, configure JDBC, set up a database, put your data in there, connect to it. But you know, it's not really good for AEM authors, and it's not in there with AEM. It's so you could also do page properties. Now this also requires a deployment, and it's not really what page properties were meant for. So in 6.4, Adobe came up with something called Structured Content Fragments. And basically these content fragments allow us to store data and in AEM, and it doesn't require a developer for deployment. Content authors can create models that represent the schema for a content fragment. And it's separate from page components. It's stored in the DAM assets. It is customizable, and it has API access out of the box. We'll get to that. There are a few types of fields, form fields that you can use in content fragments out of the box. As of 6.5, it was the ones listed here: single line text, multi-line text, numeric, Boolean checkbox, you can do date and time, an enumeration, which is a drop down, tags, and a content reference was basically just a path field. We needed a little bit more than that, so we went and created a few custom fields of our own. The first one, CFX ID. So this is really just an ID to represent a content fragment. It's based on the path, and then it's a hash GUID for that path. So of course, if you moved the content fragment, this would change, but it's necessary when we're querying the content fragments, which we'll get to later. I have a parent field. This allows us to reference a field in a parent content fragment located in a parent folder. We'll see that later. We have a child reference field, which goes the opposite direction, and you can pull in content fragments that are children of a content fragment. Now, keep in mind, content fragments don't have a child-parent relationship hierarchy, but we use folders to create that, and you'll see that. We got content fragment reference. So if I want to reference another content fragment, but this allows you to specify what the type of that content fragment is so that when I'm querying it, I know exactly what I'm getting back. We have an image field. So this just points to an image in a DAM, but it gives a thumbnail preview. We have a date time field that's similar to the out-of-the-box one, except you can select date, time, or date and time. We have our own tags field. This is, again, similar to out of the box, except this allows you to do single or multiple tag selection. We have a multi-text line, so just like the out of the box multi-line, except it lets you add multiple, like a multi-field of multi-text fields. And then finally, we've got a tab field, and this one requires overwriting some of the out of the box code. But it does allow you to divide your content fragments up into tabs if you've got a lot of data that you need to display in one. A little bit more about the tab placeholder. So like I said, it was necessary to overwrite out of the box code for this to work. So, you know, that's one thing that wasn't the greatest, but it does work. It uses a placeholder field, which I'll show you later. It is written. All these are written in HTML Sling models, and if it doesn't, if you don't specify any tabs, it just falls back to the out-of-the-box JSP for the tab for the rendering. Here's a little visual of, if you're not familiar with the content fragments and how they're made up, this is a little visual slide. I'm not going to go through all of it, but just pointing out, okay, when you're looking at the definition of a model or the model data types, the fields line up to the things visually on the content fragment model in the touch UI. And so, like, you know, number one, field icon, that's the icon that shows up next to your field, resource type, field properties. I'll give you the slide so you can go through it later, but I'm going to move on. So we want to access these content fragments. How do we do that? Well, out of the box, we have a couple options. We have content services. This is going to utilize content fragment list component. So basically, you're adding a content fragment to a page, you're exposing which fields you want, and then you're accessing it through an API that way. There's also the assets API, which can be used with content fragments because they are assets. You can access them directly. It doesn't require knowledge of the asset hierarchy, but it's good for developer utilization for full CRUD development. And these are both REST-based. So if you ever heard of GraphQL, GraphQL lets you query things in a more granular manner of exactly what you want and not what you don't. There's a schema that's generated that tells you the API and what's available to you to query. It's built on the Java GraphQL library. You can filter results. There's some basic filtering built in right now. More complex filtering will be to come. And immediately reflects model updates. So if content author goes in and changes the model, the schema is going to be updated as well. And we have the ID fields that I explained before, and doesn't require DM hierarchy knowledge necessarily. So for my demo, this is sort of the data that I've come up with. I like sports, I like baseball. So I've developed some sample content that's geared around that. So I'm going to switch to demo, and I will answer questions after I'm done. And that sun is very bright. So let's get over to the demo. If I go in here to Touch UI, first I want to let's go look at the content fragment models that we created. So assets, go to content fragment models. AEM CF Extras. Okay, so these are a bunch of models that are geared around sports, basically. You got conference, division, organization. We got sport, team, and player. And so if I'm going to go into team here, here's the ID field I was talking about. This is a read-only field. You just put here as a placeholder. It's more for convenience for seeing that ID that's generated. Some out-of-the-box fields. Next, we've got CFX tags. So you see over here, we got multiple selection option if you want to make this a multi-select versus a single select root path. On down, we've got the image field. This is going to hold the logo for the team. We got a date time field, and over here you can see that we've set it to date. If we drop this down, we got date and time options as well. Here's the parent attribute field. So I want to pull the conference name for a given team. It's going to search up the hierarchy of folders. It's going to look for a model of type conference and return that display name for that model as conference name. Another parent attribute, and then a child reference field. So child reference field is the opposite. So we're still going to specify what type of model we want. We can also specify what folder we want underneath there. So that's not necessarily just search everything, but maybe search just a particular folder for this type of model and pull back those content fragments. Now, if I go to player, there's a couple additional ones. Getting some parent attributes. We've also got CFX reference field. Now this is this is really just a reference field that you can specify what type of model you want, so that I know in my, when we get later into the GraphQL, I know what type of model that I am referencing in this field. Oh, and then tab placeholder. So this is the one that creates tabs to divide up your content when your content fragment renders. So that's the models. Let's move on over to the content fragments. We've got AEM CF Extras here. I'm going to go down to content fragments: sports, baseball, organizations, major league, conferences, national league, divisions, central, teams. My favorite team, the Cubs. Let's open up Cubs. Okay. And we see this parent field is pulling back Chicago as the city. State, the tag field is pulling back Illinois. I've got a multi-tag field that didn't really make sense here, but it's just to demo the fact that you have multiple selection tags. Also back up here, the ID. Now that UUID is generated based on that path so that we have something to reference. Last World Series date. So if you remember, that was just set to a date. National League is the conference, the division. Those are all pulled in from the parent. And players are actually child content fragments pulled in. So you can see there's a players folder under here. And if I go to one of the players and open them, you'll see that the tabs are rendered here. So I can divide up this data and make it a little nicer. And if I go down here, I can see this is the content fragment reference field that I showed. And I'm pointing to the sponsors for this player. And those are content fragments themselves of type organization. Okay. So now let's see the GraphQL piece. If I go down here to AEM CF Extras, let's open the Graphql Playground. I've already got a query set up here. Let's go ahead and erase that. Okay. All right, so first let's start out showing that in the GraphQL Playground, we're actually pulling back. You can see the schema already. First thing you do in GraphQL is look for the root, or the query root. So that's the type query. And I can see these are based on the configuration folders in AEM. So we have a conf/we retail. We have an AEM CF Extras. We have a core components example in this instance. We're going to pay attention to the AEM CF Extras. So that's a type. Now, if I look at the type for AEM CF Extras, I see all the methods I have here. I can query sports by list or by ID, and we'll show a couple examples of each of those. GraphQL Playground also has docs, so this is all here out of the box, but schema is really what I'm going for. And if I just run this schema also, let's go ahead and type in a query here. So automatic completion shows me I have AEM CF Extras. Start with that. Let's get a list of teams. So team list. Let's get an ID. Let's get a display name. And let's get those players we were seeing. And the players, let's get an ID, first name, last name, and those sponsors. Okay. And that query, and you can see I've got a team list here. Several teams in the National League. We're going to look at really the only ones I have filled out, honestly, is the Cubs. So I'm not finding the Cubs. So let's narrow that down a little bit. I'm going to put a filter in here. And again, it's got basic filtering with more complex filtering to come. Okay, so here's my team Cubs. So it's much easier to find what I'm looking for. Maybe I'm looking for a player. So now that I've got this, I've got an ID for each of these players. So let's use a by ID query instead. So if I do this, it shows me I can do player by ID. Let's put the ID in there, and let's see. We're looking at Chris Bryant, so let's do Chris Bryant. Okay. That's name. Looks like I've got an error here in my GraphQL. I'm missing a bracket there. All right, now we can run it. And so, as you see, it pulls back Chris Bryant by himself. A little bit different when you do the ID, because I pull back an object and not an array. I go back and do player list. Let's take off this. You'll notice I was getting an array of players. And if I just want an object that represents a player, that's when I do an by ID. So it's that's the difference between doing by list and doing by ID. And you'll notice that each of the fields, are honoring their own logic. So if I did, when I do players, first name, last name, and when I did sponsors, sponsors is the reference field. And back here on, let's do team list, we can do division name. That's doing the parent. Oops. Got some data errors there. Okay. Have about 10 minutes for questions, and it looks like there's a lot. So there's a question about IDs, using paths instead of IDs. It's more for a, make it more, I guess, just looks better than putting a path into the ID. It looks more like an ID. Like I said, I try to make this so that it's not, you can't really tell it's coming from content fragments necessarily. It's just a GraphQL API that's coming from somewhere. So that's kind of the reason we went with a hash for the path instead of the actual path. It's instead of the actual path itself. I should note, I do believe there is a similar feature in the works at Adobe for AEM. I can't say exactly what's going to be different between this and that. But they are working on something similar, and That's really all I know. But you can go out to the GitHub project that's out there publicly available and get the code. There is content in there. However, I did see a couple issues this morning that I need to fix. It's continually in progress. We are looking to add more fields. There's code cleanup. There's Sling injectors that are in the works. Lots of features that we're adding. So if you want to go out and try it out, it's out there. There's documentation on content fragments at the Adobe site. And then this is all based on the Java GraphQL library. So it's all standard stuff in the Java world. And feel free to go out there and check it out. Any other questions? Feel free to contact me afterwards. This is, again, I guess I rushed through it a little faster than I anticipated. I could have taken more time on some things. So if you have any questions about anything in particular, definitely hit me up. Definitely be interested in hearing your ideas and thoughts. So there was a question, let's see. What is the take on the content library hierarchy versus a more traditional file? Yeah, so as you saw, I needed to have some sort of content hierarchy for our use case. So in this case, for my example, the teams are under organizations and teams have players. So we needed some sort of way to relate that and make it so the content authors didn't have to actually use content reference fields for every relationship. So the easiest way was to use folders, and as you saw in the structure, so in case anybody didn't catch this, but in the structure there's folders, and inside each folder, so for sports has its own folder, baseball has its own folder, and the content fragment inside it. Organizations doesn't really have a content fragment, but probably why my query didn't work. Major League Baseball is under the divisions, and then conferences. So this is what they're referring to. So since there isn't really a content, they're not like pages where you can put pages underneath pages. In AEM, you can't really put content fragments under content fragments per se. There's variations, but that's different. So instead, we're using folders, and the parent and child reference fields are assuming that there's a folder structure underneath your content fragment, and it starts the current folder and goes down, and then of course goes up for the folder to find parents. So that just makes it easier for authors to point out relationships. Of course, your query could pull in, let's say, the sport for a team and figure it out, I guess, but more of a convenience way to grab fields from other content fragments and pull them into the one, so you only have to query that content fragment. If that makes sense. Variations, speaking of which, that's another thing that's not in here yet, but working on that. Let's see what else. Any other questions? Way to enable default fields in your models. Oh, so by default, my models have tags? I'm not sure I understand the question there. Currently, the JSON response is not customized. If you want to talk to me later, maybe give me some more details of what you have in mind there. We could definitely consider that. We have not had a need for versioned content fragments in my experience yet. Yeah, I can imagine version history being, I'm not sure how we would do that. Possibly put versioning in here, I guess, if it's something that's makes sense in a lot of use cases, but I haven't had that use case yet. And keep in mind, this code is in progress. I'm continually going in there and refactoring, cleaning up, adding new things. So if you get in there and it doesn't work, just contact me. Like I said, I think some of the content that I uploaded, I realized there's some issues that I'm going to try to fix today. Everything should work. It's just needs some cleanup. A couple minutes left. Has anybody got any other questions? As far as customizing the JSON response, I mean, it's really just pulled from the models and content fragments. So if you were to change those, it changes. But maybe if you can send me an example of maybe something else that you want to customize in the JSON response. It's really just based on standard GraphQL practices. Let's see. All right, any other questions? We got about 40 seconds left. Any plans to merge some of the common features that Sling started to provide around GraphQL? Good question. So actually, when I started this, the Sling stuff was not available yet, at least to my knowledge. This has been a work in progress for a while, sort of on the side. And I didn't attend the session this morning, but I definitely have heard a lot about that, those features and some of the caching. Oh, that's one thing I didn't really cover too much is the caching. There's a few different caching. You can cache the schema, you can cache the compiled query, not the results, and then also the results are cached, but they are only cached if you send the exact same query twice. We're looking to put some more complex caching in there, some more intelligent caching. And then of course, I know the Sling stuff has their own caching model, which can actually use an ID to cache at the dispatcher level. That's something that I find very interesting that maybe I would consider incorporating into AEM CF Extras. All right, thanks everyone. Definitely hit me up if you want to discuss further.